Clara's breath hitched as the tension between them hung thick in the air. Her heart was racing, the pulse of her fear and desire mingling into something electrifying. Riker's eyes never left hers, his presence pressing in on her like an irresistible force. But there was a softness in his gaze now, a promise, a reassurance. His large, strong form, so intimidating at first, felt strangely comforting as he held her there, so close, so present. For a moment, everything around them faded away. The kitchen, the distant sound of the movie still playing in the background, the remnants of the world outside, they all disappeared, leaving only the two of them. Clara felt his breath on her lips, warm and inviting, and despite the fear, there was a spark of desire that bloomed inside her, pushing away the last of her hesitation. She couldn't stop herself. She leaned into him, her lips finding his in a kiss that started slow, tentative, as though testing the waters. The moment their lips touched, her body responded instinctively. A warmth spread through her, and the tightness in her chest loosened, replaced by a growing need. Riker's lips were firm and soft, a tantalizing contrast to the intensity of his presence. He kissed her with a gentleness that she hadn't expected, as if giving her the space to adjust, to feel comfortable in his embrace. But as the kiss deepened, the fire between them ignited. Riker's hand slid around her waist, pulling her closer, his body pressing against hers. Clara's hands moved to his chest, feeling the heat of his skin beneath the fabric. He was so big, and yet, in this moment, it didn't feel like a threat. It felt like a promise, a silent vow to take her as far as she was willing to go. The kiss became more urgent, as if both of them had been holding back, waiting for this moment of release. Clara's fingers tangled in his hair, feeling the smoothness of his fur beneath her touch. Riker's lips moved against hers with growing hunger, his tongue tracing the contours of her mouth, coaxing her to open further, to let him in completely. For a moment, she felt consumed by him, by the intensity of his touch, the raw energy between them. It was like a wildfire, spreading through her veins, igniting every nerve. She pulled him closer, her body pressed tightly against the wall, unable to resist the overwhelming pull of his presence. Riker's hand cupped her face, tilting her head to deepen the kiss, and Clara melted into him, her body surrendering to the wave of sensation that crashed over her. He was so much bigger than anyone she'd ever known, but in his arms, with his lips on hers, she felt something else, wanted, desired. Their kiss became an unspoken promise of what was to come, a connection that was both tender and electric, wild and gentle all at once. For that moment, Clara didn't care about anything else. She was lost in the heat, in the intensity of Riker's kiss, and the feeling of being completely, utterly claimed by him in a way she hadn't expected, but couldn't deny. As they finally broke apart, gasping for air, Riker's lips brushed her forehead softly, his voice low and teasing. "See, nothing to be afraid of, sweetheart." Clara's breath was shaky, her body still humming with the memory of his kiss. She met his gaze, a shy smile pulling at her lips. "I think I'm starting to believe you," she whispered, her voice barely above a breath, but filled with a new sense of certainty. Riker's grin widened, but there was something more in his eyes now, a promise of more, of everything that was still to come. "You should," he murmured, his lips hovering near hers once more. "I'm not done with you yet." As Clara caught her breath, still reeling from the intensity of the kiss, she felt a shift in the air. Her pulse quickened again, but this time it wasn't from the kiss. There was something different, something that hadn't been there before. Her gaze flickered down, and her eyes widened as she noticed it, his growing presence presence. Between them, where she hadn't noticed it in the heat of the moment, a large, unmistakable bulge had formed. It was thick, heavy, and it seemed to pulse with a life of its own, pressing firmly against her. Her breath caught in her throat at the sight of it, her mind racing to process just how big it was. Her face flushed instantly, a mix of surprise and uncertainty washing over her. She had felt him shift during their kiss, had noticed his body responding to the tension between them, but this was something else entirely. The sheer size of him, pressing against her in a way that was both startling and intoxicating, made her heart race in a different way. Riker seemed to notice her hesitation, his mischievous grin widening as he caught the direction of her gaze. He didn't look embarrassed or even apologetic. In fact, he looked a little amused, as though he knew exactly what was going through her mind. Surprised. His voice was low and teasing, full of that confident edge. He tilted his head slightly, his eyes flickering with a mix of playfulness and something darker. "I warned you, sweetheart. I'm a lot." Clara swallowed, her mouth dry as she looked back up at him, meeting his intense gaze. Part of her was intimidated, overwhelmed by the size of him, by the way he seemed so effortlessly in control. But another part of her, the part that had been drawn to him from the start, was undeniably intrigued. She could feel the pull, the heat between them, growing even more intense now. "I didn't expect..." She trailed off, her words faltering as she tried to find the right way to express the shock and arousal coursing through her. Riker chuckled softly, his lips curling into that devilish grin that made her heart race in a completely different way. He pressed a little closer, his body towering over hers as he leaned down to whisper in her ear, "I told you, darling, I'm not just here to tease you. I'm here to make sure you feel every bit of me." His voice was thick with promise, each word laced with that same heady mix of confidence and sensuality that made it impossible for Clara to look away. "I know you're nervous, but trust me, you'll learn to love the way I fill you up." Clara's breath caught in her throat, her mind spinning as she felt the weight of his words and the undeniable growing need within her. Her body was responding to him in ways she hadn't expected, her nerves melting into something hotter, wilder as she looked at him. "Are you ready to see just how much bigger I can be?" he murmured, his lips brushing against her ear, sending a shiver through her body. "Let's see if you can handle all of me." The challenge in his voice was unmistakable, and Clara, despite the nervous flutter in her stomach, felt herself leaning into him, drawn by the heat of his presence, the desire that had built up between them. She knew there was no turning back now. Riker had shown her just how big he was, and now she had to decide if she was ready to embrace it. Clara's heart pounded in her chest, her body trembling as Riker's words hung in the air, heavy with meaning. The intensity of the moment, the overwhelming presence of him, all of him, pressed so close, towering over her, was too much. Her mind raced, trying to process everything at once. His teasing confidence, the sheer size of him, and the heat of her own conflicting emotions. Her breath came in shallow gasps, her vision blurring slightly as the room seemed to tilt. The tension in her body, the rush of adrenaline, and the undeniable attraction all collided in a dizzying storm that left her reeling. She stammered, her voice barely above a whisper. Her legs wobbled, and she reached out, instinctively clutching at his chest to steady herself. But the warmth of his skin under her fingertips only added to the sensory overload. The edges of her vision darkened, and her knees gave out. "Clara!" Riker's voice was sharp, laced with genuine concern as he caught her just before she collapsed. His strong arms wrapped around her, holding her securely as her body went limp. He lowered her gently to the floor, his teasing demeanor replaced by something far more serious. "Hey, sweetheart, stay with me," he murmured, brushing a strand of hair from her face as he checked her breathing. She was light in his arms, her face pale, but her chest rose and fell steadily, a sign that she was only overwhelmed, not harmed. Riker let out a soft sigh of relief, though his concern didn't fade entirely. "You really are full of surprises," he muttered, a wry smile tugging at his lips despite himself. "Didn't think I'd have that strong an effect on you." He carried her effortlessly to the couch, laying her down gently and draping a blanket over her. For all his teasing and confidence, there was a tenderness in his movements now, a care that showed a different side of him. As Clara's eyes fluttered open moments later, she found herself looking up at his face, his usual smirk softened by a hint of worry. "You okay there, sweetheart?" he asked, his voice low and steady. "You scared me for a second." Clara blinked, her mind still foggy as she tried to piece together what had happened. She flushed deeply as the memory returned, the overwhelming intensity, his teasing words, and her body's betrayal as she'd fainted right there in front of him. I'm so sorry," she mumbled, covering her face with her hands in embarrassment. "I don't know what happened. Everything was so much." Riker chuckled softly, his voice warm and reassuring. "No need to apologize," he said, sitting on the edge of the couch, his large hand resting lightly on her arm. "I might have gotten a little carried away. Guess I underestimated just how much of me you could take all at once." His teasing tone was back, but it was gentler now, less overwhelming. Clara peeked out from behind her hands, her cheeks still burning. "You're intense," she admitted, her voice shaky but honest. Riker grinned, his eyes twinkling with mischief. "I told you, didn't I?" He leaned in slightly, his presence still magnetic, but less intimidating now. "But don't worry, I'll take it slow. For now." Despite herself, Clara couldn't help but laugh softly, the tension easing as his playful nature lightened the mood. Even though she still felt a little shaky, she found herself relaxing under his gaze, the fear melting away, replaced by a tentative curiosity about what might come next. Clara sat up slowly on the couch, still a bit lightheaded, but starting to feel steadier. The blanket Riker had wrapped around her was warm, and she pulled it closer, glancing up to see him in the kitchen. Despite his intimidating size and overwhelming presence, he moved with surprising ease, almost graceful as he prepared something. Moments later, Riker approached with a steaming cup of coffee in his hands. His grin was softer this time, a playful spark still lingering in his eyes. "Here," he said, handing her the cup. "I figured you could use this after all the excitement." Clara accepted it with a grateful smile, her hands wrapping around the mug for warmth. "Thanks," she murmured, still feeling a little embarrassed about fainting earlier. She took a sip, the rich, bitter taste grounding her. Riker didn't say anything for a moment, simply watching her as she settled back into the cushions. Then, with a sudden, smooth motion, he knelt in front of her, his large hands reaching for her feet. Clara blinked, her eyebrows shooting up. "What are you doing?" she asked, her voice tinged with surprise. Riker smirked, his hands already gently cupping her ankle. "You've had a rough start to the evening," he said casually, his tone laced with that familiar teasing edge. "I thought I'd help you relax a little. Trust me, you'll love it." Before she could protest, his thumbs pressed into the arch of her foot, and Clara let out a soft gasp. His touch was firm but careful, his fingers kneading away the tension with an expertise that left her momentarily speechless. "See," Riker said, his voice low and smooth as he glanced up at her. "Told you I know what I'm doing." Clara couldn't help but sink back into the quiet sigh escaping her lips as he worked his way along her foot, his hands warm and strong. She hadn't realized how much tension she'd been holding until now, and the way he skillfully worked each muscle left her melting under his touch. "You're surprisingly good at this," she admitted, her voice soft and a little breathy. Riker chuckled, his grin widening. "Sweetheart, there's a lot I'm good at, but I'll take the compliment." His fingers moved to her other foot, his touch just as attentive and soothing. As he continued, the teasing in his tone softened, replaced by a genuine care that caught Clara off guard. She glanced down at him, her gaze lingering on the way his large hands cradled her feet so gently, so skillfully. "You don't have to do this," she said quietly, though she didn't pull away. Riker's golden eyes met hers, his expression unreadable for a moment, before his lips curled into a softer smile. "Maybe I want to," he said simply. "You've been through a lot tonight. Let me take care of you." Clara felt her cheeks heat, but this time it wasn't from embarrassment. She couldn't quite put her finger on it, but there was something about the way he looked at her, like she was the only thing in the world that mattered in that moment, that made her chest tighten in a strange, unfamiliar way. "Okay," she murmured, her voice barely above a whisper. She let herself relax further, the tension in her body easing as Riker's hands continued their soothing work. For a moment, it was easy to forget everything. The strangeness of his arrival, the overwhelming intensity of him, the unanswered questions swirling in her mind. All she could focus on was the warmth of his touch, the way his presence filled the room without feeling as intimidating as before. As he finished, Riker looked up at her, his grin returning to that familiar, playful smirk. "Feeling better?" Clara nodded, a small smile tugging at her lips. "Yeah, I do." "Good," he said, standing up and towering over her once more, "because I'm not done spoiling you yet." Minutes passed in a quiet, comforting rhythm. The tension from earlier had melted away, replaced by a soft, lingering warmth that Clara couldn't quite explain. Riker returned to the couch after tidying up the empty coffee cup she'd handed him, his golden eyes watching her with a gentleness that seemed out of place for someone so impossibly large and intimidating. Without a word, he settled beside her, his broad frame sinking into the cushions with a calm that seemed to envelop the room. Before Clara could fully process it, his arm slid around her shoulders, pulling her gently against him. Clara stiffened for a moment, her body hyper-aware of just how much space he occupied. His sheer size dwarfed her, making her feel delicate and small in a way that sent her pulse racing again. But the warmth radiating from him was irresistible, and after a moment's hesitation, she allowed herself to lean into him. "See, told you I'd help you relax," Riker murmured, his voice low and soothing as his arm tightened slightly around her. Clara let out a soft breath, her cheek resting against his chest. The steady thrum of his heartbeat was oddly comforting, and the heat of his body was like a blanket wrapping around her. "You're warm," she said quietly, her voice almost shy. Riker chuckled, the sound deep and rumbling in his chest. Perks of being a shifter, sweetheart, built for keeping someone cozy. They sat there in silence for a moment, the movie on the screen long forgotten, as Clara let herself sink into the strange comfort of his presence. But then she noticed it again. Him. That presence from earlier, the one that had startled her so much, was back. But it wasn't as overwhelming now. Instead, it was more subdued, though still undeniably there. Her body tensed slightly, her mind torn between curiosity and caution, as she became acutely aware of it pressing subtly against her hip. "Relax," Riker murmured, his voice dipping into that teasing tone that made her cheeks flush. "I'm not doing anything, yet." as she met his gaze. "Riker," she hissed, her face heating with embarrassment. He grinned, entirely unrepentant. "What? You can't blame a guy for reacting. You're all snuggled up to me, looking adorable, and your scent." He inhaled deeply, his golden eyes darkening just slightly as he gave her a playful smirk. "Let's just say it's distracting." Clara buried her face in her hands, groaning softly. "I can't believe this is happening," she mumbled, her voice muffled. Riker's laughter was warm, his arm wrapping around her more firmly. "Hey, don't overthink it," he said, his tone softer now. "I'm not going to do anything you're not ready for. I just like being close to you, and maybe teasing you a little. Okay, a lot." Clara peeked out from behind her hands, her expression a mix of exasperation and something softer. Despite his teasing, there was an honesty in his words that made her heart flutter. "You're impossible," she muttered, though there was no real heat in her voice. "And you're irresistible," Riker shot back, his grin widening as he pulled her back against his chest. "Guess we're even." Despite herself, Clara couldn't help but smile as she settled against him again, her nervousness fading bit by bit. His warmth, his presence, the way he held her like she was something precious. It was enough to make her feel safe, even with the lingering awareness of just how much he was holding back. Clara had fallen asleep cradled against Riker's impossibly warm and solid chest, her breathing soft and even. His presence, as overwhelming as it had been at first, had a strange way of calming her when he wanted it to. The soothing rise and fall of his chest, combined with the exhaustion of the night's surreal events, had lulled her into a deep, dreamless slumber. But something stirred her from her sleep. She shifted slightly, her senses slowly coming back to her. The first thing she noticed was that Riker was no longer beside her. The warmth of his body had been replaced by the coolness of the room, and for a moment, confusion flickered through her. She blinked her eyes open, adjusting to the dim light of the living room. And then she saw him. Riker stood a few feet away, his broad back turned to her as his massive form loomed in the low light. His movements were deliberate, his large shoulders rising and falling in a way that seemed almost strained. As her gaze shifted lower, her breath caught in her throat. His hands were working, there. That unmistakable, imposing part of him she'd noticed earlier was now fully visible, no longer hidden by any attempt to conceal it. It was enormous, far more so than she dared to imagine, and his hands, large as they were, barely seemed to encompass it as they moved steadily, almost urgently. Clara's face turned crimson, her heart hammering in her chest as she stared, frozen in place. She knew she should look away, that she should say something, but her body refused to obey. There was a primal magnetism to him, a raw, unrestrained energy in the way he moved that left her spellbound. Riker must have sensed her gaze because he turned his head slightly, catching her in the act. A slow, mischievous smirk spread across his face, his golden eyes glinting in the dim light as he locked onto her. He didn't stop, his hands still moving with that same hypnotic rhythm. "Enjoying the show, sweetheart?" he drawled, his voice thick with amusement and a teasing edge that made her cheeks burn even hotter. "You were out cold, and I figured I'd take care of something while you rested. Didn't expect you to wake up right now, though." Clara's mouth opened and closed, her words failing her as she scrambled to sit up, clutching the blanket tightly around her. I didn't mean to," she stammered, her voice high and flustered. Riker chuckled, the sound deep and sultry as he turned fully toward her, unapologetic in his display. He took a slow step closer, his movements predatory yet casual, like he enjoyed watching her squirm. "You've been stealing glances all night, Clara," he said, his tone low and velvety, You don't have to be shy about it. I don't mind being admired. I wasn't, she began, her voice rising in protest. But he raised an eyebrow, his smirk widening as if to challenge her. You were, he interrupted smoothly, his voice like honeyed silk. And it's fine, in fact. He trailed off, his eyes darkening as they roamed over her flustered expression. I like it. Clara's breathing quickened, her body frozen in place as he came to stand right in front of her, his size and presence once again dominating the space. His hand reached out, brushing a strand of hair from her flushed face, his touch surprisingly gentle despite the tension in the air. You're adorable when you're embarrassed, he murmured, his voice softening as his golden eyes searched hers. But you don't have to be. I told you, Clara. I'm here for you. Whatever you want. No need to be afraid. Her heart thundered in her chest, her mind racing as she tried to process the mix of emotions flooding through her. Part of her wanted to bury herself under the blanket and pretend this wasn't happening, but another part, a deeper, more curious part, couldn't tear her gaze away from him. Riker, she finally managed to whisper, her voice trembling slightly. I don't know what to do. His smirk softened into a more genuine smile, his hand resting lightly on her shoulder. That's okay, he said, his tone reassuring even as the heat in his gaze remained. You don't have to know. I'm not going anywhere. Just let me guide you, if you're ready. Clara swallowed hard, her body still trembling as she met his eyes. She wasn't sure if she was ready for anything, but the magnetic pull of him, the way he made her feel so alive and so vulnerable all at once, was impossible to ignore.